Good morning, your Yoga Flow family. It's a pleasure to see you. My name is Gilbert, for those of you who don't know me. And today I was just going to spend, that's me, leading a little workshop. Um, so today I was going to spend some time talking about creating a container. And basically what that means is just how you're showing up into the space where you're going to be teaching and the environment that you hope to create for your students. And the biggest thing with that is just one, being intentional about the space or how you want students to feel. And granted, you can't control how they feel, but you can at least control the different elements of that. So I'm kind of going to walk you through what I suppose I would do with a physical space, and then also just talk a little bit about how I would try showing up and what I hope to do with people coming to take my class. And so actually this is one of the studios I get to teach at. I'm in between classes right now. Just taught earlier this morning, and I'll be teaching again at 9:30. But so this is Shakti Yoga Studio in Nashville. And so here we are going into the studio space. And so this is the room that I get to teach in. And first things first is just kind of how I want the room to feel, whether if it's a heated class, if it's an unheated class, playing with the heat. The room feels like a little stuffy. And so turning the fans on, opening up windows just for a little bit, especially the next class is going to be for about another hour and a half. So I've got some time to let things kind of move around. And if you want, something like setting incense to kind of just clear the room out, or maybe some sage if you have that. Before class, I'll typically have some music going. And the music kind of just depends on, I guess, sort of the kind of class that it's going to be. And sometimes it's a more meditative class, so it'll just be a little more ambient music, a little more calming. On the weekends, those classes are usually a little more like upbeat and fun, so I have a little like more fun music, things that more people might be familiar with. I'd love when spaces have kind of, you can't really see it right now because it's bright, but have like some fun lighting. And I like to use the lighting whenever I can because I think that creates just a nice atmosphere, whether that's a disco ball like they have or just some LED lights, or if you're teaching in the evening or just a darker space, teaching like a candlelight class is always really nice. Um, and then even something like opening the windows, how bright do you want the classroom to be? Um, and how do you want that to feel? And so a lot of that obviously is going to vary from space to space, and making the most out of the space that you have. I've had to teach in offices, I've taught in a parking lot, I've taught in, parks. So just a lot of things where there's definitely there's a lot more that's out of your control. Um, but it's nice in a studio space where you do have kind of more agency as far as how you want to set things up for your students and how you want them to feel as soon as they walk in the room, how you want them to, I don't know, with the ambient music, it's nice because then it'll be a little more like grounding. The film music kind of gets them a little more excited about it. Um, yeah. And so with that, it's also just, for one, physical space, just being intentional. And the second thing is just your music. Obviously, depending on the class, a yin class, you're going to use more grounding music. A vinyasa, depending on the style, depending on the place, it could be a little more upbeat or also still grounding. I like mixing that up because, each experience is going to be different. And I personally take the music very, I put a lot of thought behind what the playlist that I use for my classes. And that is because that's what I was drawn to as someone who I struggled connecting to myself quite a bit. And so music always resonated with me where I didn't have necessarily the words to express what I was feeling or how I was feeling. Music was something where I was like, I could connect with the lyrics. And I was like, oh, I've felt this, or this resonates with me. And so I like using a wide variety of music. So that way, if someone who's, let's say they're new to yoga or they're kind of like uncomfortable, let's say I throw on a song that, I don't know, a rock song or a rap song or something that they might have thought, oh, like this isn't a song that you would typically hear in a yoga class, where it's like if they're in that class, maybe they hear a song that resonates with them, and then they feel more welcomed into that space, more of like, oh, this is for me too. And that's kind of my goal in teaching, is to have people feel welcome, help them feel the most, whatever they need to feel. Like I just want everyone to know that it's okay to be in my space and to show up just as they are. And so that's how I use my music. And I know that it's not going to be, um, not every playlist is going to be for everyone. And so even then, what I'll speak to is, all right, well, sometimes that the yoga for that day will be not how can you still get what you need to out of a class where, let's say, the music isn't your favorite, or the teacher, let's say you're expecting a class and with one teacher and there's a sub. And so, and if it's not the person you're expecting, can you still show up? Can you still get what you need to out of that class? Um, so that's my intention usually with music and with the variety of it, because yeah, I want to be able to create that space that's for everyone. And then also moving on from music, speaking to sequences and the kind of class that you're teaching, and just being intentional with the movements, the sequence that you put together, whether that's some studios, I mean, at least in Nashville, a lot of like power studios, which is kind of most of the stuff that I end up teaching around town. Um, a lot of studios have kind of like set sequences or expectations, and they kind of give you like a skeleton to work around or to work with. And so just how can I teach that in a way that, like the music, is accessible kind of to everyone? And so that way everyone can kind of do the best they can when they can. And how can I speak to that, um, and help them just be more successful? And even if that means taking a child's pose, even if that means when they're taking an early or just a savasana in the middle of class, and then even speaking to them being in that space and just grateful that they're in that space. And even though if they're not doing, let's say we're in the middle of a sequence or a flow, even if they're not doing that flow, just like encouraging them to do what is best for them at that given moment. So it's like still pay attention to your breath, even if you're taking a child's pose. Be here with us, and when you're ready, like join us, come back into it. And I think that is just also empowering to the student, where we're all going through these motions kind of together, and we're all having our own unique experience in the classroom in those 60 minutes. And I even had one guy one time, which I thought was just super funny. It was the early 6 a.m. class, and the guy basically, we started class in Savasana, and he stayed in Savasana the entire time. And I obviously like went on through the entire class. And then afterwards, when we were getting everyone up and ready to go, he got up and he looked at me and was like, Gilbert, that was a great class. And I was like, hey, like, thanks. He's like, it's exactly what I needed. And I was just happy he showed up, even though he just laid there the entire time and rolled from his belly to his back. And he did what he needed to that morning. And I mean, you can't force anyone to do anything. And I'm just happy that, for one, people are showing up and doing what they need to for themselves. So now I guess speaking to the classroom, and at the start of class, a lot of times there's an opportunity to, either you can set an intention for your class, let's say you're teaching a theme and you want to break that down, or I typically, unless I really have like a theme or something that I want to focus on for the class, I kind of like leaving it open-ended. And I tell people, if they show up with an intention or whatever their practice means to them, feel free to use that intention, to give their practice more direction. And a lot of times when I was first starting to practice, there wasn't necessarily a lot of intention behind my practice. It was more of something for me to do, you know. And it wasn't until like later on where I got just more into it, where I started recognizing how I could use my practice on the mat, um, or how that was a reflection of life off the mat. And so now I kind of try to speak to that a little bit more. And so I let students kind of choose their own intention if they have one. But otherwise, my recommendation for the most part is just to show up open minded and to use this as a space to experience, where we get to experience when we feel strong, when we feel weak, when something feels challenging or unbalanced, or when we get to have like a breakthrough. And so just really staying with your breath and not resisting, not trying to force anything, not trying to hold back, but just staying with your breath and allowing yourself to feel what you need to feel. And then allowing yourself to not get too hung up on any one given thing, but allowing yourself to acknowledge, to let go, and to keep moving on, especially when it's something that is, I don't know, when you notice that a student is getting hung up, let's say they're really trying a balancing posture, and you notice that they're kind of like wobbling back and forth or they can't stay in it. And so just reminding or speaking to the classroom about the things that you can do to help them, whether that's focusing more on your grounded leg and having a strong foundation, having a steady gaze, having an engaged core. So everything's working together as opposed to just letting, let's say, your foot overcompensate for the rest of your body. It's like, no, we're here to feel those wobbles, to feel those shakes. And then how do we handle that? How do we handle when we get discouraged? How do we handle when something's hard? How do we handle something when it's easy, when it feels good? Do we kind of just like check out? Or what else can we do in that space? And so that's kind of what, in my class, is what I tend to speak to, because I want people to recognize how something feels on their mat and to really recognize it so that way they can take it off their mat. How do they handle a stressful situation at home or driving through traffic? How do they handle, are they able to like celebrate a little success when they get something that they've been like working on or working towards? Or do they kind of, are they always like beating themselves up? So it's just like cultivating that practice of self-awareness and to allow yourself to experience and to allow yourself to feel. And because also for me, like I was relating to the music earlier, yoga is really what, as a guy who didn't have an outlet to speak to what I was feeling like emotionally, I was just very disconnected. And yoga was kind of like the first thing that showed me, hey, this doesn't feel good in my body. What can I do? Or I can do something different. You know, I don't need to keep doing this pose this way if it doesn't feel right. Or why am I making this so much harder than it needs to be when I was first trying to, let's say, get crow pose. And it was like I was just trying to muscle through and power through the pose as opposed to just letting it kind of naturally unfold. And so once I started really recognizing that connection um, to my body and to myself, that really started to translate to life outside of my mat, where I'd notice if I was getting like stressed out or when my body was starting to, in rush hour and dealing with traffic, where I would start to like get tight or clenching my fists or clenching my jaw, and I would just like feel it. I'm like, hey, like remember to breathe, remember to use the tools that you have on your mat, and still allowing myself to feel that. But it did take a long time for me to eventually like tap into the more emotional stuff, the things that were closer to me that I didn't realize I was necessarily, um, I guess, repressing, um, because I didn't have like an outlet. I didn't have the words to communicate. I didn't know that that was okay, because the examples that I had like in my family was like just things that we'd never like talked to, that I didn't think we could talk about, that I didn't know that it was okay to feel. Um, and so being able to tap into that and now understand it a little bit better, it's like that's the space that I'd always wanted to create, but now I can speak to it a little more clearly because I've been able to get to that level myself. And so which kind of leads to the next point of this, of creating a space for everyone. And this is just the way I approach it is, if my intention is for people to show up and to just be themselves without any inhibitions, and I want them to feel welcomed, like I need to do the same. I can't expect them to show up and I'm putting on a show or I am being something other than myself. And so I've got to be very, and it's not like it's anything different. It's the way I'm talking to you guys now. The way I'm talking to you now is the way I would talk to a classroom with students, whether that's one person or whether that's 50 people. Um, so just kind of making that connection of, I'm not necessarily the teacher and you're the student, but we're all in this together. I just happen to be the one who's giving the direction today. And that's also why I like moving with the students or demoing. So it's like we're moving through it all together. It's not me telling you what to do and me kind of just watching. It's, hey, we're doing it. I'm keeping an eye on everyone so that way I can offer the right cueing, so that way I can help people um, be more successful in the pose, especially if I notice that maybe they're doing, well, successful isn't necessarily the word, but just to feel more comfortable in the pose. When something's like challenging them, it's like, okay, how can we maybe take a step back, reevaluate, and then take that step forward, so that way we can come back to our breath, come back to a strong foundation, come back to a steady gaze, and now let's deepen the pose from a better place. And so, yeah, so just showing up as myself and talking to them as though they're my friends, as though I've known them, um, yeah, as though I've known them as a friend. And for me, yeah, I want to be able to connect with people and I want them to feel comfortable in this space. And so the personal shares and stuff, I think, are also very important because for me, I like to feel connected to some of my favorite teachers are the teachers that I feel connected to. Obviously, I don't have to know everything about them, but it's more about the space that they create. It's more about the things that they're willing to share. And I try to, I guess I share when it's appropriate. And I do believe that there is a fine line of not making it about yourself, but sharing something in a way that is just more like relatable, that's a little more open ended and without getting too specific. Because the last thing that you want is to, especially if you're going through something difficult, if you're facing some sort of like challenges in your personal life, last thing you want is like kind of bring everyone down. And then you're kind of getting them out of their practice. And I say this because, um, I mean, I've had that experience with like teachers where they're kind of just like coming and then they end up just like unloading everything. And, and sometimes some people, I mean, as you're aware, as you've probably been through, or you've heard, like people are going through some things are difficult. And sometimes it's felt like a therapy session where they're kind of just like unloading everything. And me being a student, sometimes I'm like, oh crap, is this guy or this girl, are they okay? Are they going through like too much? But then it gets me out of my practice and now I'm concerned and now I'm worried about what they're bringing to the table and what they're bringing into that space. And so I just try to be very conscientious of, let's say I'm having a bad day. And it's like, I'll open up and I'll say, hey, you know what, like today, I'm not feeling necessarily the best, but I'm always happy to be in this room. I'm always happy to be with the students, with whoever it is that shows up. And, and I want them to feel that even though we're going through our thing, I'm glad that we get to be together. We get to work through and move through our own stuff in a space that's supportive of one another. And that's the container that I hope to create and that I want people to show up or to be willing to show up for. And not just that, I want them to be able to take that off of their mat. So that way they feel more comfortable being themselves out in the real world, that they feel comfortable expressing themselves or finding what feels best for them as opposed to kind of just going through the motions that they've been going through. I want people to show up and be comfortable enough to explore themselves, to really dive deeper into what something means to them. If it's something that they like, it's like, all right, if this pose, or if you really want to work towards this thing, how can I help you get there? Or if you really are interested in this other thing, it's like, what do I need to do as a teacher to help my students get to where they're going? And that's a big thing too, with just being familiar with the people that show up to your room or show up to the class, especially once you start having regular students and you kind of start to notice their tendencies. And it's cool seeing the way they kind of shift around the room, especially from a brand new student who, let's say, hides in the back corner when they first kind of like show up and they're unfamiliar with any postures or they don't even know what yoga means. And next thing you know, they're kind of moving more. It's like the middle of the space. So they're moving into the middle of the room. They're moving up to like the front row. And then suddenly they've got like their own yoga mat. And suddenly they're just like ready to try like arm balances. And they're just like eager. And it's cool to see that progression. It's cool to see that growth in a person in general. And it's nice to know when a lot of it has to do with you're at least providing that space where they feel comfortable doing that. Because it can be intimidating to someone who's never done yoga, to someone who, depending on the studio, a lot of studios can have very tight-knit communities where obviously we want it to be welcoming, and that might not always be the case. But even if that's not the case with the studio, that's still my intention as a teacher when I get to teach my class, no matter where it is, whether that's at a public library, whether that's at a park, whether that's at a studio, whether that's at a parking lot. That's what I want people to take from it. And let me see if there's anything. At least basically my thoughts on creating a container. And that just biggest thing is be intentional with the space you want to create. And then how can you go about creating that space? How can you create the physical environment, whether that's the lighting, whether that's the heat, whether that's the music? How can you create an ambiance that you want your students to feel, whatever you kind of want to set them up for? And then with your sequence, how can you teach in a way that is accessible to everyone, and even providing like modifications, and even if it's not accessible to everyone, providing the space for and the freedom for students to do what they need to for themselves, and then encouraging that. It's like, hey, you're taking child's pose, you're taking savasana. I cued for a warrior one and they're taking a knee, or they're doing, I don't know, like a half split or something. It's like, all right, cool, like do your variation, as long as they're not being like a big distraction to the rest of the room. I'd rather have someone do kind of their own thing. And then last thing is just being true to yourself in the space. And that's what I love so much about getting to teach is, and especially now having going on 5 years now, 5 years now teaching full time, where it's like really my job. And the deeper anyone gets into yoga, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar, it's like you're just constantly understanding yourself better. And I mean, that's the goal of it, is to understand yourself better and to just try working towards the things that you know feel better for you, that feel truer to you. And I feel very fortunate that my job requires me to understand myself better and to be a better version of myself. And it's awesome to see that connection just translate with the way I'm able to communicate with students, and then just the growth that I see in them. And it is cool to just see all of us kind of growing together. So whenever I learn something new in a posture, and then it's like, okay, cool, now I can like break this down, now I can like talk to them. Or if I can apply some sort of yoga philosophy from off of the mat into the classroom, so that way they can like take it off of the mat. Um, and then that is just so great. And then because then students like will open up to you, students will talk to you, and then if you're, I think the best compliment that a student can give other than like showing up is when they start inviting their people, their significant others, their family, their friends to your classroom, or to your class, where they're like, you've got to take this guy's class, or you've got to take this girl's class, or you've got to, when you're starting to get recommended, or someone comes up to you and they're like, oh, I heard so much about your class. And it might, and sometimes it does add like pressure to, oh, I've got to do things a certain way, or there's this sort of expectation. And I kind of got to like shake that off, because the expectation is, for me, is just, I just need to be myself. I don't need to do, the sequence doesn't have to be anything that's going to blow people's mind away with like creativity. It's just, how can I be myself in that room? And how can I provide the space for others to be themselves and to do what they need to? And that is my personal approach and the container that I'd like to create. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to leave it in the comments. If you want to talk about the container that you hope to create, I would love to read it. I would love to chat with you, and keep creating good things. And I wish you all nothing but the very best. And until the next one of these discussions or classes that I get to lead for you, I'll see you all then. All right. Take care.